Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Serpent Sea by Martha Wells. So every single Martha Wells book that I have made a review for so far on my YouTube channel, I have sat down in front of my blank page to write up the script, super nervous that I won't have anything to say, because I just deeply enjoy these books on an immersive, unexamined level. And I'm always like, oh my god, I'm gonna sit down to try to talk and just say, I like this book, and then run out of words. But I've yet to do so. And in fact, my Martha Wells reviews have been some of my longest, and looking at page count, this is gonna be one of them. So like many commercial authors, I feel like there's just a lot more to dissect under the general good vibes. So I'm just gonna dive into this one and trust that hopefully I'll come out the other end with a coherent thought process. So this is the second book in another series, and thus expect there to be some minor spoilers for the first book in this synopsis and the rest of the review. The first book is called The Cloud Roads. If you haven't read that one, I do suggest it. It's good. Maybe wait, go back and read that one. Maybe watch my review of The Cloud Roads, because I'm sure it's lovely. And then revisit this review. But The Cloud Roads ends with Moon, our main character, and the Roxuran court that has taken him in, fleeing the colony that they have lived in for over a generation in the search of the Roxuran homeland. They are going home to a place of giant trees called mountain trees. They are hoping to take back possession of their colony tree that they abandoned over a generation ago. But when they arrive, something is wrong. Their tree is dying, and if they do not find out what is wrong and find the one piece that has been stolen and bring it home, their colony tree will fall, and they will have nowhere else to go. Moonstone, Jade, and a crew of other Roxurans set out on a quest that will take them across the Roxuran forest and out into a dangerous, uncrossable sea in search of a city that exists on no map, in the hopes of finding the seed they need to save their tree and their entire court. Okay, so I'm gonna say I am still very much enjoying this series. Like, I loved it. Sometimes I'm not in the mood to read, though. I want to work on something else. Even if I'm enjoying a book, I start to feel like picking it up every night is a chore I'm forcing myself to do. I almost always enjoy myself once I get into reading, but sometimes getting started is a bit of a hurdle for me. I have never felt that with any of the Martha Wells books I have ever read. And I did not feel it with this one. Her books are ones that I think about when I'm not reading. That I can't wait to get home from work so I can have a chance to read. I'll often end up packing her books in my bag to go to work, even though I know there is absolutely no way I can read at work, because it gives me that vibes of maybe I'll have a moment to read. These are books that I find myself just picking up when I should be working on something else, because they are what's on my mind and what I'm focusing on. I've got to the point that I know I can only pick up a Martha Wells book to start reading it if I can afford to put down my writing and all my other projects for a few days while I just read through her books. And this one, I could put down. I was actually able to stop reading when it was time for me to go to bed. I was able to keep to my usual writing schedule. There was even one night that I got so distracted working on my audio play project, which hopefully you'll be seeing on this channel before this video goes live, though who knows how scheduling will work out. But I didn't get to reading until like 30 minutes later than my usual reading schedule, and I was super disappointed to lose that 30 minutes of reading. But the point is, I was able to set aside the hyperfocus and work on something else. And this is something I was not able to do with any other Martha Wells books. And I think that part of that is because, yeah, there are some undeniably weaker elements to this book. There will be a few small things I'll talk about, and one really big thing. First, the small ones. I feel like this series is a book with about 7 million minor characters, and I had a lot of trouble keeping them separated in my mind. I will admit, I did have to keep glancing at the glossary in the back to be like, wait, who is Root and who is Heart? Who are these people? Especially considering a lot of them have very similar names. It's set up that if they're born in the same clutch, they have related names, and that just made it harder for me to remember who they were. And also, the secondary characters like Chime and Flower are strong and stand out, but the tertiary characters? They just didn't have enough of a character stand out from the million other random characters. And I think that is part of the nature of the story being told here. This is a series about someone who has lived a very isolated life, finding a big community. And that is a story that needs a lot of tertiary characters. Characters that you know by name, maybe know one or two character traits about them, but don't really know well. In the real world, these are the people that you see that work in the same office building as you, but not in the same department. These are the people, the neighbors you wave at randomly on your way to work, and you know them by name, but you wouldn't invite them over for dinner. These are classmates that you don't hang out with. In these books, it's the 20 or so members of the court that Moon can identify and recognize by name, but he has no real relation to them. It makes sense that they exist in this book, and they are standing there for a purpose, but there were just a lot of them, and I couldn't keep them straight. I did notice this in the first of the Roxurin books as well, but I just liked the rest of the book so much that I barely noticed. And also, Moon was so new to the colony in that book that my confusion as to who was who sort of mirrored his, so it all made sense. There's also something about Jade that feels a bit like the generic strong female lead. Like, I like her, I understand why Moon likes her, she does active things, but there's just something about her that feels sort of basic. There's also the covers. I know this should not be a big deal. This is not something I should pay a lot of attention to, but I really detest the cover here. This is not at all the way I feel the Roxurin are described in this book. They're really a lot more fish-like on the cover than I expected, and I don't know, that just bothers me. I've looked ahead in some of the later covers I like better, but I just hate it when it's so visibly obvious that the cover artist was working from a paragraph-long brief and had no chance to actually read the entire book. But all of those are little things. The big thing I want to talk about is that this is a world with problems. And it's pretty common to see problems in fantasy worlds. First of all, it's natural. The real world has problems, especially like nowadays. It's hard for me to get into a book where the world doesn't have problems. It feels A, boring, but also unrealistic. But also, fantasy has a long history of using fantasy world problems to discuss real world problems. The most obvious and cliche is the whole trope of racism against elves or dwarves or whatever as a stand-in for racism against real-world minorities. But that's usually dealt with pretty directly by the narrative of the book. If we see a world that is racist against elves, a huge portion of the story arc is going to be about our elf hero standing up against the corrupt system, or our human protagonist learning that it's wrong to be racist against elves, or whatever. And I love that fantasy can do this, even when it is badly handled. I just love the fact that social commentary is an inherent part of the genre. But this book features a world full of problems that our heroes are just not addressing. Most of this book takes place on a city controlled by a ruling class of magicians who have used their power to control the economy and resources so completely that the people around them are barely surviving. People are starving, unable to get work, and many of them have fallen into such despair that they spend much of their lives as possible intoxicated. And the ruling class are all part of one race, and the most desperate poor class are all part of a very different race. And this is pretty clear racist dystopian oligarchy. And it's clearly presented in this book as this is a bad thing. This is not one of those cases where the author just doesn't seem to notice they've written a dystopian society. But our heroes show no interest in trying to fix this. It's not like it's set up that they could, or that they are in a place of moral obligation to do so. And in fact, their own society is a very strict hierarchical structure. But Moon just seems to treat the horrors of this society they've stumbled across as, well, that sucks for the people trapped here. Our Roxurin heroes arrive in this city on their own quest, fulfill their own quest with very little attention paid to how they could or will affect the city around them, pretty much accidentally overthrow the status quo, and leave without any thought as to whether their actions would make things better or worse for the people who live here. Like, I'm pretty sure the city actually is in a much better position at the end of this book than at the beginning, but that's just not really something on Moon's radar. And that really makes sense for Moon's character where we are in his character journey. He is used to taking care of himself. He is used to it being him against the world. And a good portion of his journey in this book is about him trying to get to the place of understanding that it is not anymore him against the world, that he now has a community. So it's now the Roxura and him against the world. Also, the Roxura in this book are in a position that really is one of they need to put on their own life vest before they worry about anyone else's. Their entire community may die out if they don't complete this quest. But our heroes are only passively good when it comes to anyone outside of their group. Moon was all right with abandoning the other prisoners when he escapes from the tower. He even considered stealing their boat and only went out of his way to save them when it occurred to him they might be helpful later on. And there's this undercurrent. At some moments it's subtle and some moments it's blatantly obvious, but there's an undercurrent that this entire world is in drastic decline. If this world was a ship, it's sinking. In the first book, we meet several groups that are clearly refugees. We see ruins of destroyed communities. We meet the Roxura, and the court that Moon meets is clearly failing. But in the first book, we get the impression that it's just this colony, that maybe it's just this area that are fighting against the Fel. But in this book, when we get back to the Roxura homeland, we start hearing dozens of passing references to how many of the colony trees are empty, how much of the territory is unoccupied. The other colony that we meet seems healthy, huge, and prosperous, but it's sort of pretty clearly implied that they are one of the only ones that are prospering. We've seen really 4 major cities across the 2 books so far. 2 of them are ruins that people have built another much smaller city on top of, and one is crumbling with less than a quarter of the buildings occupied. Only one of the cities that we've seen so far is thriving, and it is in a highly defensible position. There's this undercurrent that this is a world under siege. I was pretty sure in the first book that that was all because of the monstrous Fel that were spreading over the world, but in this book we see one city that has clearly never seen the Fel, and is still crumbling. It's got the vibes that there is something deeply wrong with the entire world. I have a theory that the arc of this entire series is going to mirror the arc of this book, of the characters focusing intensely on saving themselves in the beginning, and that almost accidentally leading them to helping the rest of the people. And that makes sense for an overarching arc in a series, starting out as really neutral, heading through passively good, into actively good. But this leaves a slightly weird feeling to this book, where our main characters are seeing all these horrible things and sort of just shrugging it off as not related to them. Especially when we see that the Roxura seem to be physically stronger, better at fighting, and more resilient than almost anyone they meet. And being able to fly gives them this huge advantage of movement. So it feels a bit icky to see them saving others only when those others could possibly help them. They don't actively attack people or kill anyone unless they have to, but it's always framed that they are doing so just not to spark a war rather than any other reason. It's an odd place for the morality of the book to be at. Not bad enough to be anti-heroes, but not good enough yet to be true heroes. And I think that might strangely be because this book reads like part of a series that was actually fully, completely planned out from the very beginning. I have a good feeling that I know what the arc of the entire series is going to be shaped like, and it's very clear to me that Martha Wells knew every bit of the arc of these characters before she wrote word 1 in the first book. And I would never say that's a bad thing. Like, I've definitely read books that it's clear that the author had only the slightest idea of where the hell the series was going, and that often means things like the tone of the latter books not matching the tone of the first books at all, characters completely changing personalities across the series, plot holes, backtracking on world building or just the rules of magic or whatever, or for that matter, the series just feeling directionless. But at the same time, there is one little problem to series that are really well shaped out. And that is that each book starts to feel more like a chapter within a book than a complete story. we are not always getting a full character or story arc in each book. And I think this is one of those books. And not just because the hero's journey did not advance to a good landing point. There's also a lot in this book that feels a bit like just shit happening that will be important later, but doesn't actually majorly impact the story of this particular book. Book 2 of Naomi Novik's Temeraire series had a similar vibe, that there's a lot of things happening that you can tell are going to be important later in the series, but in that book it's sort of like, okay, why are we stopping in Africa? But in this one, it's mainly 2 segments. All the segments with Emerald Twilight, they seem to be a lot more connected to the series than the actual book, if that makes sense. Other than that, I loved this book. The world building is stunning. There are so many amazingly gorgeous places with complex physics and just enough description that I got a beautiful picture in my mind without it ever feeling like it devolved into just scenery porn. I want paintings of these places on my walls. We've got mountain trees with entire communities built inside and along the branches. We've got a floating, decaying city. We've got a leviathan that's big enough that it's not a character or an animal. It's a place. And these places are all occupied by amazingly interesting and wildly different peoples. In the previous book, we mostly got to meet groundlings, people who live, on the ground, and some of the shifters. But in this book, we meet sealings, which I will admit I kept reading as ceilings, which is just a me reading problem. But I love the fact that this series is going all out on different ways vaguely humanoid creatures can be put together. I still love watching the way the Roxura courts interact. I love how their society works, how different it is, and the fact that it is a society with clear and obvious flaws, but also a lot of good to it. And I love the play between Moon being an outsider who really has no idea what's going on, but also instinctively acting more like a Roxura than not. He's got the vibes of a character who can change the bad parts of a culture, but in these early stages, he's just learning how the world looks. And that makes exposition really smooth, because we learn with him. Also, it allows the author to throw in some serious, lovely gut punches about things that he didn't realize or didn't know was happening. Also, a little passing thing. I've read a lot of books that feature characters who are very focused on having kids and wanting kids. And that is almost exclusively the realm of female characters. And when we see male characters thinking about having kids, it's usually in the form of like, preserve my lineage, having a son to pass the realm on to, things like that. But in this book, we find a male character who thinks a lot about wanting to have and raise children. He's clearly the one in the romantic pair that has more paternal instincts. And even though the narrative of wanting to have kids is not something that really hits for me, it was a nice change to see a male character who just wants to be a dad. It's also a part of his broader character arc and drive to find a community, a family, and a place to belong. So it all works really well. And even with the flaws I found in this particular one, I still sat down and broke my embargo against buying new books to buy the next one as soon as I was done reading this one. I think this is a really solid second installment in a series. Can't wait to read more.